Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is intrude. Let's take a moment and look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear intrude used is to mean to put oneself intentionally into a place or situation where one is unwelcome or uninvited. It's kind of a long definition, and let's talk a little bit about what some of these words mean. So to put oneself intentionally, that means on purpose, right? So here we're not talking about something that is an accident, but it is done with sort of planned thought or on purpose, okay? And we're putting ourselves in a particular place or a situation where we are not welcome or where we have not been invited. A second way you might hear intrude used is to mean to enter or introduce something into a situation, and for that to have some kind of disruptive or adverse, which means negative, effect. Okay. We'll look at some example sentences later that touch on both of these definitions. For right now, you should just know that intrude is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, you're going to drop the E because we have a verb that ends in vowel consonant E, and we do that before we add the ing ending. That makes intruding. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by just adding D, since this verb already ends in an E. Now, our base verb, intrude, ends with a D sound. Not the letter D, but the D sound. And this means that when I add the ed ending to this verb, I'm going to add an extra syllable to the word. And the sound I'm going to make is an id sound. So the past tense and the participle forms of this verb should sound like this. Intruded, intruded. Okay. There are a couple phrasal verbs you might encounter with intrude. What you're going to notice is their meaning is quite similar. So you might hear intrude into, or intrude on, or intrude upon, but these phrasal verbs are really going to mean that someone is involving themselves in a situation, in a way that is bothersome or it's unwelcome. Okay? An example of this might be the sentence, her parents always intrude themselves into her relationships. So in a way, this means they're getting involved. The relationships here could be dating relationships, it could be friendships, but they're becoming involved in a way that isn't necessary. It's bothering, or maybe the significant others or the friends don't want that involvement from parents, right? Not from the individual with whom they are trying to have either a friendship or dating relationship. Now, the reason I broke these phrasal verbs into kind of two sections here is to show you that it's pretty common to see a separation between intrude and our particle into in this first example. And so here we're describing and using a reflexive pronoun, themselves, to indicate what is becoming involved. Okay. Now, let's look at intrude on and upon. These get used in a more similar way, and what follows on or upon is sort of the thing that's maybe being bothered. Maybe that's a situation or even a place. An example of this might be, am I intruding on your conversation? Right? So maybe it's kind of a polite way for me to ask. Maybe I'm interrupting. Maybe I'm speaking when I shouldn't be. Maybe two other people or a small group were trying to have some type of conversation, and now I have started to bother and interrupt that conversation. Now let's move on and continue using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today, let's practice the simple present and the present perfect. We'll start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about our habits and our routines. It's also used to talk about facts. The thing about making sentences in the simple present is that we must pay attention to our subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, then I'm just going to use the base verb to make a positive sentence. But if the subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to add an S to the end of the verb. An example of this, okay? The proposed law intrudes on free speech rights. Okay, so that's our phrasal verb we just talked about, kind of intrudes on. I would say that this is bothersome, but it also, I would say, kind of relates back to having that adverse effect or adverse impact on something. So this is sort of another way of saying it violates free speech. You hear people make statements like this many times when there are different proposed ideas and there's someone imposing them, and they might feel that it violates or intrudes on some other personal right or personal freedom. Okay. Here, the proposed law is a single law, so it's like saying it. That's why you see an S on the end of the verb. Now let's move on and talk about making negative simple present sentences. To do this, again, I'm going to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use do, not, and then the base verb. You might also hear don't, and then the base verb. But if the subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use does not, and then the base verb, or doesn't, and the base verb. You can see that in my example sentence. My supervisor doesn't intrude on my free time. So, with this type of sentence, I'm really suggesting I'm not being contacted outside of work to answer questions or do work. I get to spend my free time however I choose. Now let's talk about making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, I start with do or does, then you're going to notice the subject, and then the base verb. An example of this: do people intrude in your workspace regularly? Right? So maybe if you have an office or you have a cube, right, this would be kind of coming into your area, maybe without your permission or without a welcome. That some people can find that extremely bothersome, and that it affects their productivity, right? How much they can produce or how much they can focus. My last little note here about the simple present, I always like to point out to my students, notice the only time I'm adding S to the end of the verb is in the affirmative. I do not add an S in the negative or in my yes or no question. Now let's move on and talk about the present perfect. We use this verb tense to talk about actions that started in the past and continue into the present. We also use it to talk about actions that occurred at some unknown point in the past. Many times this is called the indefinite past. So we might not be sure when it's happened exactly, right? We might not have an exact date. Could have been something that occurred just last week, could have been many times over the span of 10 years, right? It's just going to depend. Just like the simple present, we need to pay attention to our subject in the present perfect. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, we're going to use have and then the participle form of the verb. If the subject is he, she, or it, we'll use has and then the participle form of the verb. You can see that in my example here. He has been stalking her for over a year, and he's intruded her home more than once. Okay. This is kind of an upsetting sentence to read, but it is unfortunately something that happens, right? So this is another way of saying someone has broken into a particular person's house, right? They weren't invited in. They entered without permission, without a legal right. Okay? So with this sentence, you might notice he has been stalking her is an example of the present perfect progressive. So this is an action started in the past and it seems to be continuing into the present. The second part of the sentence is where you get the present perfect. He's intruded her home more than once. Now, we don't know exactly when that occurred or when the multiple occasions have been. We just know that it's happened at some point in the past. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about negative present perfect sentences. To do this, again, I pay attention to my subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, we use have, not, and then the base verb. You might also hear the contraction haven't, and then, sorry, not the base verb, but the participle. Pardon me. I think I misspoke there. I was on autopilot from the simple present. So let's say that again to be clear. So I, you, we, they, we're going to use have, not, and then the participle, or haven't and the participle. If the subject is he, she, or it, we'll use has, not, or hasn't, and then the participle form the verb. Here's another example. You haven't intruded upon our conversation, right? You might give that statement to someone to reassure them, no, they're welcome to speak or participate in a particular conversation. And finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, I start with have or has. Whichever form matches my subject, that subject comes next. Then we use the participle form of the verb. Here's my last example. Have other countries intruded into the territorial waters? Okay. This particular question, again, is suggesting perhaps many other countries have come into a particular area where they legally do not have a right, where they are not welcome, where they have not been invited. That's what that question is asking about. Now, let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb intrude. The first word we're going to talk about is the noun intrusion. Intrusion. The noun intrusion really just means that action of intruding, coming into a particular place where you haven't been invited, where you're not welcome. An example of this might be, many celebrities can't stand the intrusions into their private lives. So this might include cameras and video recording any sort of movement. I know, unfortunately, there are people who try and get pictures through windows, things like that. So it's that action of observing them when they haven't been invited to do that. Another related word you might encounter is the noun intruder. This is a person who intrudes, particularly someone who enters a building or some other space with criminal intent. So they break in or come into a particular place, maybe to hurt someone, to steal things, or some combination of those types of activities. So with it in their mind that they are going to commit a crime. An example of this, you might hear somebody say, call 911, there's an intruder, right? So someone we haven't given permission to be in a particular place has now entered a building or an area that I hope you'll never need a statement like that. That it just seems so scary to me. Another related word you might hear is the adjective intrusive. This adjective means that something is causing disruption or annoyance. Again, think back to that meaning of being bothersome. It's disruptive or annoying because it is unwelcome or uninvited. An example of this. How should I respond when I'm asked intrusive questions? I saw questions similar to this in an advice column regularly. Someone was writing in and asking about how to kind of interact with some family members who ask maybe very personal or private types of questions. So you might hear those questions as being described as intrusive. One last word for us today. It is the adverb, pardon, I got a little mistake in my notes there. It's the adverb intrusively. That ly suffix tells us it's an adverb. So when the adverb intrusively is used, it means that something is tending to or likely to intrude. So something we're describing something that perhaps is being done without invitation, describing something that isn't welcomed. An example of this might be the interviewer asked intrusively personal questions of the interviewees. I've heard stories about this sometimes as people go for job interviews. Someone asking questions that may be illegal, if not just inappropriate, not related to the work that someone might be actually doing in that type of position. Again, I hope that doesn't happen to you, but I appreciate you watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.